Kingdom CLAUS. Book 2. Of War and Snow. By Adam David Brown. Chapter 4. Old Eyes. Early morning slowly crept upon the mountains and the sun was starting to rise. A faint pink shade began to color the sky and a stiff breeze blew from the east, as Groddo and Ermon sat at a grand table. They had been there all night, drinking and thinking, bickering and arguing, but most of all, they had been discussing the fate of their folk. With still no word or sight of Shula, the worry amongst the tribes had grown to a fever. Would they gather forces and blindly venture south to try and find the shaman? Would they make a broad strike and flank the attacking forces that sieged the first garrison? Or would they muster all that they could and attack Groddo itself? Every outcome would result in the same fate, absolute defeat. Ermon had managed to talk sense into Groddo, who wanted to charge down the Great White Plain and avenge his people. This was simply impossible, and Ermon was not about to waste the lives of his warriors on such a suicidal idea. Ermon stared intensely beneath his wolf skull crown and said, "We have no idea of how many soldiers lay behind those walls. Amaranth's army is said to be beyond measure. Surely they would see us coming from miles away. Groddo, my brother, we would be dead before we reached the wall." The two then raised their cups of ale and drank a stern swig. Groddo wiped his mouth and said, "Aye, brother. Certain doom is down that road, but glory as well. Glory that would be cloaked in foolishness, my friend. I will not go this way, nor will I let you leave this place if that is your path," Ermon replied and took another drink. A moment passed and the frustration grew even greater within Groddo. He sighed deeply and said, "What is to be done then? I cannot simply wait here to be attacked, and I cannot stand idly by while one of my folk is in enemy hands. We must give the old bird another go." He spoke of Sarno, a great mountain hawk who belonged to Tess, Ermon's youngest cousin. Sarno was an elder hawk, but his old eyes could still see for leagues upon leagues. He was their best chance of finding any enemy encampments that may be holding Shula. However, they have sent him out a few times before to no avail. When he would return, he would tell Tess the same thing: there is nothing. Tess could understand Sarno. Mountain folk often had deep connections with animals, they relied on each other for survival. Sarno could talk to Tess through clicking his beak. No one knew how, but Tess would know what he meant. "All right then, old man. We shall let the sun get higher and we will try again," Ermon said and stood up from the table. He gulped down the rest of his ale and continued. "But for now, we must rest. No good will come of us being half alive." Groddo thought this was a good idea, as they both had been up all night. He then stood up from the table and bowed to his host. "I will have Tess sent for mid-morning and we shall see what Sarno tells us this evening," Ermon said as he walked to Groddo and hugged him sternly. Satisfied with this conclusion, Groddo turns and leaves Ermon's house. He walked through the village to the hut that had been prepared for him. The once humble village was now filled with mountain folk. Not only were there Ermon's people and the survivors of Groddo's village, but Dager Elkhelm had dispatched a large portion of his warriors to post within Ermon's realm. This was a busy and crowded place, and Groddo took comfort in this, knowing that there was always strength in numbers. He reached his hut, went in and laid down upon the feather bed and was fast asleep. Ermon stayed awake for the time being and eventually called for Tess to be summoned to court. He sat upon his wooden bone throne and awaited her. Almost an hour passed and Ermon started to nod off, as a young woman dressed in brown hides and a fur vest came through the doorway. Her long, brown hair was tied back and a leather band was fashioned to her head that a large, brown and white hawk feather dangled from. A small dagger with a bone handle hung from her leather belt and her brown hide boots were covered in snow. This was Tess. Her dark green eyes peered in from the doorway as she asked, "You called for me, my chief?" Ermon stirred from his faint sleep, smiled warmly, and said, "Ah, cousin. I did. We will need to ready your Sarno. I wish to have another look at the south ridge." Tess bowed and replied, "Aye, my chief. He is out gathering rabbits right now. He should be returning shortly." Sarno was not only Tess's friend and companion, but he was an important means of food for the village. The mountain folk had always used certain animals to aid in finding food. It is one of the ways both they and the animals themselves have come to survive in the mountains. There were a few other hawk keepers in Ermon's village. Each of their hawks were tasked with fetching rabbits and plump snow squirrels. However, none of these other hawks could see as well as Sarno, and it was mused that he was the captain of the hawks. "We shall await his return then," Ermon said as he stood from his throne and walked over to greet his little cousin. The two then walked out into the village and looked upon the mass of people. Everyone had been keeping busy with the daily chores, both out of necessity and to keep their minds from worrying about the fate of their people. Tess turned to Ermon and said, "My lord, it's a strange fate to be surrounded by so many and yet feel so alone and afraid." Ermon sighed gently and replied, "My dear girl, you would be surprised to hear that I feel the same as you. These are dark days, cousin, and dark days will always work in such a fashion. Take heart, my kin, dark days never last forever, no matter how much they seem as though they will." Tess smiled and felt relieved to know that one so mighty and brave as Ermon would feel the same fear that she did. There are those that think we should not have gotten involved those 5 winters past, that we should have let the kingdoms fend for themselves. "And perhaps then we wouldn't be in such fear," Tess said, looking to the sky. There's a part of me that agrees with them. And a bigger part of me that knows the war would have found us by some other means, even if we hadn't gotten involved. We raised our arms in defense of these lands, and our people, and for the North and the world itself. The enemy knows now that its conquest will not be as easy as all that. For us to have done nothing would have ensured their victory those 5 winters ago," Ermon said as he put his arm around her. Suddenly, a cry came down from the watchtower. "The party returns, my chief." "Open the gate," Ermon hollered in reply. The southern gate was pulled open and in walked 5 warriors, led by a tall young man dressed in a long brown fur and leather coat. On his back was a quiver of arrows, and in his one hand he carried a wooden bow, the other, a lit torch. This was Bregan, cousin to Ermon and the older brother of Tess. He extinguished his torch in a snow pile and walked over to Ermon and Tess. Ermon hugged him warmly and said, "Welcome home, cousin. What news from the ridge?" "Nothing moves south of here. There are no tracks anywhere and Groddo's realm is still empty. No tracks through the forest nor any past the ridge. No enemy movement whatsoever. Strange that they wouldn't have stationed there by now," Bregan said as he took his quiver from his back. Ermon sighed deeply as he was relieved that there wasn't any enemy encampments, but he was troubled by this at the same time. He stroked his beard and said, "The enemy is a strange beast. We do not know what hunts us or why they do so. It's difficult to guess their movements, but we must continue to try. You've done well, cousin. Rest yourself now." Bregan bowed and went upon his way. It was then that a piercing call came from above. It was Sarno announcing his arrival. The two looked up to see the shape of a grand hawk at full span. Sarno was truly a sight and seemed more splendid than any other hawk. In his huge talons he clutched a clump of large rabbits, 5 or 6 of them to Tess's reckoning. Sarno flew lower, dropped his cargo upon the snow and landed on Tess's outstretched arm. "Welcome home, Master Sarno," said Ermon and petted the hawk captain on his head. He was an old hawk and his brown feathers had begun to shift to white. He was a large hawk too, Tess's arm would often bow under his weight. He was old but healthy, and his eyesight had not lessened in their ability. It was this eyesight that Groddo clung to so fiercely. Sarno would seem to be his only hope in finding his shaman. The other shaman of the villages had tried to reach her through their dreams, but had no success, as if there had been some magic shielding her from them. They would have to rely on the eyes of the skies, they had to depend on Sarno. Ermon began to hope the same as Groddo did, but did not expect to hear any new word from yet another skybound search. Bregan and his scout party had yet to discover anything either. Searching from above and searching from below was a good method, but yielded nothing so far. No matter how fruitless it was starting to seem, Ermon felt they had to try. He then commanded, "Let him rest a while and send him to the southern ridge by noon." "Aye, my chief," Tess replied and bowed. Sarno was well rested as noon approached and Tess sent him to the sky. Upward he flew over the trees and soared down the mountain toward the southern ridge and was gone from sight. The day had clouded over and a heavy snow began to fall. An hour or so had passed, and Ermon and Tess stood awaiting Sarno's return. The snow was falling rather thick and heavy now, and out of it, a shrill call cried and Sarno flew down through the sheets of snow. He perched upon Tess's arm and he shook the snow from his feathers. "Hearken to us, Captain Sarno," Ermon said, and he and Tess took Sarno into the chief's house, out of the weather. Once inside, Tess looked and listened intensively as Sarno went about clicking his sharp beak. Tess's eyes raced up and down, trying to make sense of what the hawk was telling her. She turned to Ermon and said, "My chief, he says much, but what it is, makes no sense. He speaks of the snowfall. He says it falls everywhere, but a small part a few leagues down from the southern ridge. What do you suppose that means?" Ermon thought a moment and concluded, "We shall ask Thorndro." The news that Sarno had brought was odd and seemed as though there was more at work. The snow had given them a clue, no matter how bizarre it was. Bizarre clues can be of magic, and mystical things needed to be examined by those of magic dealings, by a shaman. They walked outside and Tess let Sarno go back to his little house, for his job was done and he had been more help than anyone would have come to guess. Ermon and Tess rushed through the village to Thorndro's hut. It was of thatch and wood, with a variety of animal bones and colourful stones affixed to the doorway. Smoke rose from its small chimney and from inside, a faint chant could be heard. If anyone were to guess which hut was a shaman's, it would be this one. The door was but a flank of thick sticks that was barely hinged to the doorway. Ermon opened it and the two went inside. The air inside the hut was heavy with an acrid scent of burning herbs, and there were small tables with candles and small bones scattered about. Kneeling in front of the fireplace was Thorndro, an old man cloaked in a reddish fur robe. He realized he had guests and ceased his chanting. He rose to his feet, turned, and said in a rather high and smoky voice, "Ah, my chief has come to me. What is it you ask of me today?" He was small and frail-looking, with a white, pointy beard that willowed down from his chin. A brown fur cap covered his bald head. He was adorned in beads and gemstones of all sorts that hung from his neck. He reached for a long wooden staff that had an owl's head carved on its top. He leaned upon it and listened as Ermon and Tess explained what Sarno had seen and asked if he could make any sense of it. Thorndro hummed a strange tune as he walked to one of the small tables and picked up a handful of small bones. He rattled them in his hands for a moment and then threw them into a wooden bowl. He looked at the pattern they had made and said, "To see what is not there is to peer beyond a spell. The snow falls everywhere but not where there is nothing. And where there is nothing, surely there must be something." Ermon and Tess looked at each other as they were now more confused than when they first arrived. Ermon spoke up. "My shaman, I'm afraid we do not understand." Thorndro laughed and said, "There is something where there is nothing, the bird has said. He can see what we cannot, and that is, nothing." Of course. It all makes sense now." Ermon and Tess were at a loss for words as they started to feel quite awkward. Ermon had often thought that Thorndro's long age was starting to play at his mind, and this instance was further proof of such. Tess began to speak as the shaman quickly interrupted her. "A spell. A spell. It is all a spell. Our enemy is hidden from our sight with a spell. Must be a dark and heavy one, yes. A spell is but a riddle, and we have found the answer. Shula is held where a spell of shadow has fallen. We cannot see this place as there is nothing to see." Ermon was struck with this answer as it all became clear to him. He laughed and said, "This must be true. It is the only sense that can be. Our eyes have been tricked by a spell. And a powerful one at that, yes, powerful. The enemy holds Shula in a hidden fortress. Hidden to eyes, but not to snow, yes. They did not think of that. We never think of snow, but snow thinks of us." Thorndro said, and began to giggle and sing to himself. Ermon and Tess watched this display with amusement. They gathered themselves, and Tess asked, "Is it possible to lift such a spell, my shaman?" Thorndro stopped his singing and went silent. He was trapped in thought as a long moment passed. His face grew stern and he replied, "Not by any of us. The winter wizard, perhaps, but not by us. We haven't the grace of time to wait for his journey from the Hinterborn. We must act now. Ermon said, feeling that a solution was slipping away from him. Thorndro thought a moment and began to hum. He went over to another small table, picked up some bones, rattled them, and threw them into a bowl. He studied them for a long while, began to hum again, then promptly stopped and said, "It is possible to see into the spell, to become part of it. To see what it covers. There is a chance of that, yes, yes. But we would need a stone, a bit of dark Augustus, yes, yes, that should do." It wasn't all that familiar to Ermon and Tess, but they had heard of this stone in the past. It was a strange stone that existed in the mines and caves of their mountains. It was used in many shaman ceremonies and was said to have magic properties. It had no monetary value as rubies did, instead its value came from its possibilities and was only sought after by shaman or others of magic ilk. It was said to be able to absorb a spell and adorn its holder with the same power. There wasn't much proof of this, however, and Ermon feared it was only a legend of the mountains. "Is this truly possible?" Ermon asked with a glint of hope in his eyes. Aye, as possible as you would have it be," Thorndro said as he rummaged through a small wooden chest. He hummed as he searched, moving crystals and other various odds and ends aside. He then gave a loud, "Aha!" and turned from the chest, holding a small ivory box. He opened it and said, "Here we are. Our solution." Inside the box was a pointed piece of oddly colored stone. It shone in the candlelight bizarre shades of green and blue, and other colors Ermon and Tess had never seen before. It was attached to a small housing made of bone, and attached to that was a bit of thin rope that had been tied so it could be worn as a necklace. Thorndro took it from the fur-lined box and held it up. It was an odd sight. It was smooth and dark, its hue seemed to change with every movement as Thorndro held it by the rope. "Dark Augustus, yes, yes, Dark Augustus will give us justice," Thorndro said and laughed at his little rhyme. He continued, "Bearsbane shall know of our solution. We shall find his shaman in no time at all." Ermon was both relieved and inquisitive. They may have found the key to Shula's rescue, but the larger plan that had to be attached to it had yet to be surmised. For now, their hopes rested on this strange stone. The greater hope was that the legends were true and the Dark Augustus actually did what it was said to do. However faint it was still a hope, and it was all they had. Groddo had to be told of this revelation, and Ermon sent for him immediately. Moments passed and soon Groddo came hulking into the shaman's hut. Thorndro went on to explain to him all that had been supposed and that a plan was on the verge of hatching. Groddo grumbled and said, "It is to be a rescue then, aye?" Ermon nodded and replied, "Aye, brother. But if we are to rely on stealth instead of strength, we will need someone other than ourselves. Why can't we get a bunch of these stones, gather some men, and lay waste to that hidden fortress?" Groddo asked, for he'd much rather have an all-out assault as opposed to a mission of stealth. "We have no idea of knowing how many troops are in that fortress. We could be outnumbered. Besides, once we'd begin our siege, they'd more than likely kill their prisoner," Ermon answered. "If they haven't killed her already," Groddo said grimly. No, Shula still lives. I can feel that much, but not much else," Thorndro said as he closed his eyes and looked upward. "We will need someone small and swift as snow," said Tess, scratching her head in thought. "Aye," said Ermon, "we would need a Vendigum." A storm of deep thought came over Thorndro and he began to hum. He scurried over to one of his tables, picked up some bones, rattled them in his hands, and threw them down. He stared upon the pile and exclaimed, "Ah! The union of wolf and Vendigum will be the way." The group thought of only one Vendigum. Ralo. Wolf rider and messenger of Hern. But how can we expect him to know his way around a hidden enemy fortress? Ermon asked, and rightly so. This was a good question, and perhaps it all was asking too much of the little Vendigum messenger. Running errands and delivering messages was one thing, but to go sneaking into an enemy fortress that he might not even see on a rescue mission was certainly different. Nevertheless, it would be their only choice. Pacer was the swiftest of all mountain wolves, and Ralo had already proven himself as a stealthy spy once before. He was often sent to Gorma to obtain, or rather steal, recipes from the brewmasters there. Since speed and stealth were needed, these two were perfect for the mission. "We must send word to Foxheart right away," Ermon exclaimed and called for his village's messenger. Preparations were made and soon the messenger of Wolfblood was on his way north up the mountain pass to the village of Herne. By this time, Rallo and Pacer had returned from Nottenburg and both Ermon and Groddo hoped that Herne did not have the Wolf Rider on any other missions. The day turned into night and it wouldn't be until early the next morning that Ermon's messenger returned with Herne's response. It was a yes and Rallo and Pacer would be on their way to Ermon's village by mid-morning. Herne's only stipulation was that Ermon could ensure his messenger's safety and well-being. This made Ermon and Groddo nervous as they couldn't guarantee anything of the like. But they figured what Foxheart didn't know would be of no harm. It was indeed just after mid-morning that the watchman cried out, "Onward comes the Wolf Rider, messenger of Herne." Ermon and Groddo rushed out to meet the two messengers and called them to council in the chief's house. There at the table, sat Thorndro with the small box of Dark Augustus in front of him. Pacer lapped up water from a bowl on the floor as the two chieftains and Rallo took their seats. "Master Vendigum, you come to us today at our behest of great need," Ermon said and went on to explain the mission at hand. It was a thing that needed much explanation and convincing for Rallo's behalf. He had never seen magic before and certainly had never used a so-called magic stone. It was also a mission that required stealth and he wasn't too confident in his ability for that. He had been a spy before, but had been caught, and luckily it was by Brody Daspatch and only resulted in a broken finger, which Anna Daspatch promptly mended. His point was, that being caught spying at a distillery would be quite different than being caught in an enemy fortress. He was understandably nervous at the entire concept, but wanted to do his part, and if he could help, he would most certainly try. Thorndro tried his best to explain how the Dark Augustus worked, but seemed like he wasn't very sure himself. They all sat around the table and discussed the plan for some time. Thorndro then stood up and walked outside. He closed his eyes and went into a trance as he began to sniff the air. After several moments of the council wondering what he was doing, he walked back in and sat down. "There will be a hefty snowfall tomorrow night. There will be no moon, there will be no light. Under cover of darkness and snow you shall make your plight. Wear a dark cloak to hide you from eyes. And enter the place that has been a disguise," Thorndro said while waving his hands about. Thorndro could sense that a formidable snowstorm was coming, and knew that there would be no moon the following night. He went on to explain that the Dark Augustus needed some time to fully absorb any spell it was near. It was decided that Rallo would travel to the woods of the southern ridge, where the foot of the mountain met the snowy flat. There he would stay out of sight and make camp within the trees, all the while watching and letting the stone do its work. Groddo and Ermon would take warriors to station just below the ruins of Groddo's village. There they would hold positions in case things went badly. They could not guarantee Rallo's safety on such an unsure mission, but providing a host of warriors at his back was the best they could do. This comforted Rallo slightly, though there wouldn't be much a battalion of warriors could do if he became trapped in a hidden fortress. It had been settled and a plan was enacted. Rallo and Pacer would move to their position the following afternoon and Groddo and Ermon would move to theirs. But that would be tomorrow's duty. This night a feast was prepared and they all ate and drank, for they might not have another chance. This was the custom of the mountain tribes, to celebrate on the eve of battle. To raise mugs of ale and eat tender food, and to sing and to laugh. To fill their souls with laughter and their hearts with bravery. Rallo and Pacer were once again splendid guests in dire times.